Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Doomer Optimism podcast. I'm here with Olek. Actually, Olek, I didn't ask you your last name, how to pronounce your last name, so I'll have you say it. I we had this series of interactions on Twitter, and I just was super fascinated by the kinds of things Olek's looking into, and writing about and thinking about. He just seems like a very Doomer Optimism type person, both in the sense of like thinking independently of the, kind of current thinking on things, but also you sent me this cool month-long cross-country trip you took across California and documented it in like a really cool and beautiful way. So like a kind of jack of all trades type who we attract to this podcast. So I'll have you introduce yourself, anything you want to share, and then we can get into some topics and questions.
Sure. Hi. Um, yeah, I'm Olek. My last name, it kind of depends on who's saying it. Most people say Pisera. It's Polish, so like a Polish person would say Pisera.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, same with
Okay.
Olek. It's either Olek or Olek, depending on who
Okay,
you are.
got it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I have three daughters who have names that can be pronounced in both English and Spanish since we spent some time in Uruguay, and so I get it. It's like some code switching.
Yeah. Yeah, so I just finished my PhD at UC Irvine. I'm doing the program is like biomedical engineering, but I'm more of like a synthetic biology person, which means building stuff using biology as the substrate. So I work on like a really nitty gritty level. Before that, I've been kind of just like bouncing around biotech for a few years. I did my undergrad at Hopkins in chemical and biomolecular engineering. And yeah, in terms of like my writing, it's kind of just a weird little hobby when I have something that seems wrong or seems misrepresented. I just can't help myself but like go back and look, where did this actually come from? Where has it been distorted in like the game of telephone that goes between science and writing about stuff? So that's the origin of a lot of my little essays.
Yeah. Okay. So I'd like to get into also what you do and what kind of career you're working towards, especially because the first part of our conversation might influence the second part, which is, I guess like science, it's ontology, and it's basically like, what kind of heuristics people are working with to be able to inform the kinds of work they do. And I think I'm increasingly of the opinion that we're in these information silos, that we have a certain kind of ontology that's accepted in certain subgroups. And then if you don't accept that ontology, you're kind of treated as a pariah, even if you're like literally just trying to reason from first principles. And then that determines a lot about what people then think of as like a moral thing to do. And so I'm going to be curious later on in the conversation to talk about like your moral approach to your, biomedical engineering, because I can imagine there are probably some horrors going on in that field. um, and like that, and what's, underlying the ontology that might lead people to do things that, at least from the outside, somebody who's not tinkering with, biology in this way, seem suspect or something we should at least ask critical questions about rather than sort of because we can do it, let's just do it. So let's table that. We'll get to that. But to start, I want you to talk, if you can, a little bit about you shared this sunscreen article with me. I have a similar article. I didn't do the like primary source research like you did. I just was drawing on this Freakonomics podcast, which then linked to a bunch of studies about car seats and how the Freakonomics guys basically went and independently tested the efficacy of car seats relative to the recommendations made by, I think it's like the National Highway Transportation Administration or whatever. And they found that basically a chest belt is as safe at preventing death and serious injury for ages 2 and up as a car seat is. And when I tell people this, I looked into the data, and they actually independently tested with crash test dummies, which was a whole rigmarole to do because the crash test dummy sites, facilities contract with these car seat companies, so they don't want to like alienate their customers. But basically, they found that independently analyzed several sources of data, including the car seat and accidents and deaths. And people like basically just don't want to hear it. Like they say that and they just think like if you do this, you are a bad mother. You're putting your children at risk. And then there's like this whole safetyist culture. So that's just one example I looked into where there's an ontology that tells you the more maximalist you can be on car seats, the more you are a good mother, a good and safe parent. You're protecting your child to the point that we're getting, these 12-year-old kids in booster seats, or, kids can't go with on a play date because there's no car seat to then have them sit in when they're 8 years old, or a booster or whatever. It's like, oh, they can't go with you. And there's all these other kind of risk factors, I would say, as risk factors, like outcomes, negative outcomes that come from this maximalist safety position. So with all that said, I want to hear your um what you did, your little deep dive into sunscreen.
Yeah, it's funny because that kind of stuff is all over the place,
It
and,
is.
like, with car seats specifically, it was, like there's a podcast I listened to, just, the Matt and Shane, like, the comedy podcast, and he's talking about his wife who was a cop for a while, and she was chill about everything except car seats, and, like, if someone didn't have a car seat, she would treat them very differently if they didn't. It's just like, I don't know, yeah, people really attach a lot of moral importance to these things, which are fundamentally scientific questions that, the truth is a lot less clear than people think. So sunscreen interested me because I saw this article that was like, should you wear sunscreen inside? Experts weigh in. And it was talking about the light from your computer potentially being damaging to your skin. And I'm like, okay, these people have gone off the rails. And what's the question here? So I just went through. Uh, God, I can't remember. There was the government agency that talked about skin cancer, like dermatology. And I looked at the claims that they made and like the studies they were citing to go into what proportion of skin cancer could be attributed to sun exposure. And that gets into like a complicated question in of itself, because how do you measure the contribution of getting a sunburn to skin cancer? And the way that people are doing it is they're looking at places where they decide there's less sun here, or there used to be people used to get less sun here. Um, and the rate of skin cancer was this. And now we look at it and we guess people have more sun exposure and there's more skin cancer. So that's how much skin cancer is related to how much sun people is getting. But no one actually has a good measure for how much sun are people getting in one time versus another. There's no like recorded hours spent outside for the people that they're studying. Um, so what they're really doing is like taking a time where there's less skin cancer, comparing it to a time where there's more skin cancer, and deciding what the cause is. Uh, but the cause is probably just not related to to the sun at all, because there's been changes in how often people diagnose skin cancer. I'm guessing it's like an insurance thing. Like my sister, for example, will go get moles chopped off when she feels like it, and it's to bill it to insurance. I'm sure a doctor would just diagnose it as like pre-melanoma or something, which gets counted in the statistics. So when people actually look into the rate of overdiagnosis, which is how many skin cancers will turn into something which actually needs to be treated, the amount of overdiagnosis has gone way up over time. So the real comparison you're making is like in this time of maybe underdiagnosis to this time of overdiagnosis, uh, you know, and then layering this additional thing that you like want to prove going into the study. Like these people want to show that sun exposure is this, because if that's the case, then you have a way to like control it.
Yeah, actually, I think a lot of this is downstream from control, and I want to talk a little bit about that too. But because one thing I put in my my car seat article on Substack was there's this sociologist called Ulrich Beck, and he kind of talks. My background's in sociology, and he kind of talks about this concept of a risk society. So this society, highly technological society where you are indeed facing all of these risks that are themselves overlapping potentially, and you don't really know how to pull them apart, and you don't really know how to measure the outcomes, and there's no really ethically appropriate way to do controlled experiments on a lot of these things. Just the total number of novel chemicals and things that we're interacting with on a daily basis. There's no real way to pull a lot of those things apart. And so I think what people end up doing is they just take this maximalist approach because they are somewhat, just overwhelmed. Like, look at how much you have a PhD in biomedical engineering, and it takes somebody like that to be able to dig into the actual data to see and pull apart these like logical conclusions based on like the kind of way you're supposed to do science, which is like, if we take this as an assumption, then we can start to pull apart what could be the causal mechanism. Um, but instead, it is like now there's a totally different drive, I think, both on the part of the individual, a sense of wanting to have control. And then there's like other incentives, like doctors want to get billed and insurance companies, pay out, and people, people want their moles removed. People are increasingly wanting to have control over these things. They just don't want the mole to change to cancer. And so they're going to go, lop it off. And now the incidence is increased. So is it, I'm trying to remember back to the article, skin cancer rates have gone up, sunscreen use has gone up, and I would assume indoor time has also gone up
That's
in the
correct.
same period.
Yeah, that's right. And
How
I
is that?
would
I mean, like, yeah.
yeah, it's like such an obvious contradiction. But it's just the kind of thing that I think people are fine dealing with. Like there's a contradiction there, but uh who cares? The experts say it's true.
Yeah,
Um
and then you have this woman who you say is like, and I totally agree, the right word for her is paternalistic. She says, we know that 90% of skin cancers come from daily unprotected UV exposure, and she is board certified dermatologist and associate clinical professor of dermatology at the Yale School of Medicine.
but yeah, people in science really hate it when people outside science come in and have different ideas or point out these kinds of contradictions. I would dispute that you have to have like a PhD to like look
No,
into
yeah,
any of
but
these
I
things.
mean, there is a certain kind of training you get. But even when you just say the words like skin cancer rates have gone up, sunscreen use has gone up, and indoor time has gone up, you don't have to have a PhD to kind of follow the logic there.
Yeah, and it's this kind of stuff is all over the place. There's a great article on Slate from a while back about the science behind secondhand smoke. Um, and a lot of the original studies that found a link between secondhand smoke exposure and heart disease were done in really small like one town. They excluded other towns nearby where they could find an effect. And when people went back to try to reproduce the literature with bigger sample sizes, any like real effect of secondhand smoke to the health links that people made originally is just it's just gone. Um, but like imagine going in and telling people that like secondhand smoke is really not something you should be concerned about. People would treat you like you're a crazy person.
Yeah, well, so from like a sociological perspective, not just understanding the actual science, but like what is going on here that um you quote unquote get treated like a crazy person if you don't agree with some sort of like scientific orthodoxy kind of thing. And I think, again, I would attribute it to this desire to have some sense of control over like a very confusing information environment. Even like you go into the grocery store and you're like, I don't know what all these words are on this ingredient list. And then I would have to be like a chemist to know, is this just like a chemical name for something simple like avocado oil or something? Or is this actually like a synthetic chemical that then has risk factors associated with, okay, so that's why you have all these like organic moms who just go down this crazy rabbit hole, which then itself is a kind of neurosis toward like clean living, clean eating, and trying to understand like how these all these things interact, which in some ways are just way more complex than we can like really navigate. I have one other question about the sunscreen article, and then maybe we can move on to um like I guess conclusions on this particular part. But you say in the article that even doctors have a really hard time, and we have this example of this doctor sort of like just assessing evidence. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because that's a very disorienting thing to think if it is the case.
Oh, oh, for sure. I mean, I think I went through a really similar thing to a lot of people that during COVID, I was paying a lot of attention to the scientific literature. Um, and at that time, like the people who were vaunted as the people you should listen to were making recommendations that just clearly didn't make sense, or have strong evidence behind them. Like, for example, with like the prioritization of the vaccine when it was really scarce, it was given out to young hospital workers who had already had COVID
Uh,
instead of older people who like hadn't had COVID. So like the only population where there's like a really clear case for getting the vaccine is older people who haven't had COVID. There's clearly a benefit there. But for young people, even if you haven't had COVID, it was unclear. Um, and if you had it, it's probably shouldn't get it. Um, Doctors like could not cope that like, okay, this could be good in one setting, but it could be bad in another setting. It's so reduced to um dealing with a complicated literature in like a really simple way. Uh and this is yeah, there's a professor at UCSF named Vinay Prasad, whose whole thing is going back and looking at medical evidence that used to be accepted as the standard of care that has been reversed. I think his book is actually called, oh man, I can't remember the name of his book, but he wrote a book about this. Um, and there's been all sorts of practices, like certain chemo, certain drugs that actually just don't work. He talks a lot about cancer screening, which is another one of these things where people tell you you have to start getting cancer screening earlier and earlier. Like every man that's over 30 should be getting like a prostate exam every year or something. And when people actually study these things, they don't turn out to increase overall survival if you compare the group who does this screening versus the group who doesn't do it. Um, but doctors just won't. First off, they won't know about the trial that actually tested the intervention. And if they hear about it, they tend to be super skeptical, even if there's like 5 different trials confirming the same thing. Uh, I'm gonna name drop another person, Marty Makary, who I think he's about to lead the FDA. Um, he wrote a similar book about this recently, and one of the examples he gives is for appendicitis. Most cases of appendicitis can be treated with antibiotics. Um, the standard of care used to be like, you get an appendectomy, they go cut you open, take out your appendix. But a bunch of trials now have found that if you just give people like a pretty strong course of antibiotics, wait a while, you can see if it'll get fixed. And in like 2/3 of cases, you don't need to get surgery.
hmm,
So this has been confirmed by 3 trials now. But in the US, if you have appendicitis, most doctors will still just cut out your appendix.
hmm.
Um, so it's kind of it's rife with this stuff. I mean, it is a little bit disorienting. I don't go to the doctor. I mean, maybe when I'm like 40, I'll start going, but um,
Yeah, well, I mean, I've had my like personally had my own share of. So we lived with my family. I have three little girls in Uruguay in South America, and they have a pretty good healthcare system. But I had this very disorienting experience of going to the doctor, trying to make sure I understood everything that was being said to me in Spanish, and then like looking things up on my phone and seeing if the standard of care or the medicine that they were prescribing was the standard in the US, but then also then looking into what the standard of care in the US is and if that's any good. So it was like such a disorienting, like I'm kind of on my own here experience where, okay, now I'm getting this new medicine. It's not used in the US, but it is used in Europe and it's used in Latin America. Should I give it to my kid or not? And like, why is this being prescribed instead of some other alternative? It's just maybe it's an access issue or whatever. I can't really know that. Um, so, I mean, I think to some extent, I'm pretty independent when it comes to medical decisions. Especially, I kind of got what the kids say black pilled on pregnancy and childbirth because I just wanted basically to be left alone. It's not a sickness, it's not an illness, it's like a natural process that your body does. And so like too much intervention, too much like prodding around, like I think has a psychological effect. So I've always kind of kept doctors at arm's length because they have these weird incentives. A lot of times it's profit driven. A lot of times it's risk in the sense of malpractice. They want to avoid malpractice. And so then they want to show that they're doing some sort of maximalist, like if they end up getting sued, then they have all this evidence. Like I did this, this, and this. We went to C-section as opposed to letting it proceed naturally. And then if the baby, doesn't make it, then okay, well, you didn't do everything you could have done and you get sued for that. So yeah, I mean, I'm wondering if you think as somebody who does science, like if you can psychoanalyze what's going on scientist groupthink. I know to some extent it's normal in the scientific community, or at least the way science is supposed to be done. There's a consensus, and then there's a few outliers that challenge this consensus, and then those outliers grow and grow until the consensus changes. That's when science is done best. It's like that's kind of how it goes. You want to be conservative, you don't want to change the consensus too rapidly. But you don't want to stick with the consensus when there's mounting evidence against it. So like, yeah, what's your take on that?
I think that consensus as like a mechanism for science is a pretty new thing.
Mm,
Um, yeah, I don't think that it really like was how science used to be done.
really? Okay.
It really wasn't until like after World War II that peer review started to be like the way that science is disseminated. Um, and the peer review process is basically designed to enforce consensus. It if you think about it, like you start a project because you basically wanna show something because you want your paper to get published. So what happens is you start this project with, like, a result in mind that you know will please reviewers.
Right.
Um, you submit it to a journal. The reviewers that get assigned to it are people who have been in the field and for the most part are representing the scientific consensus. If they don't like your paper, even if it's, like, technically well executed and hard to argue with any decisions you made, um, they'll be a lot more nitpicky if they don't like what you're saying. If they like what you're saying, then like technical issues, you can let stuff slide. So it makes it a lot easier to get papers published
Right.
if you're just kind of like towing the line. Um, I think for the most part, like individual practitioners of science are not they're not, like, really thinking about, how they're placed in the system. They're not thinking about, like, "Okay, I have to generate this result because otherwise it won't get accepted, even though I know it's wrong." They're just thinking like, "Oh, I'm not doing a good job with my science because it's not turning out the right result." And then if you do the test 100 times, maybe a couple times it looks like what you want it to, and then that's what you publish.
Mm,
Um, and, doctors, part of it is malpractice, part of it is but I think they just, like, think this is how it is. Uh, I don't know if people really consider, that the outliers could be more justified than the consensus. Like sometimes the consensus just landed in a bad place, and it's because of this like mechanism of how science is disseminated now. It's really hard to change, and it takes a
Mm,
really long time.
yeah, I mean,
Um,
I thought, or at least, maybe we can talk a little historically about like, science since the beginning and what was done. My understanding that was that you've got like, a few leading thinkers. They come up with some, I don't know. I'm always thinking about like physics as the example of this. Like physicists mostly are working off of this theory, but they're happy to be proven, like when done well, they're happy to be proven wrong. And where it has broken in a modern sense is when something is technically well done, but comes to conclusions that go against consensus, it doesn't get accepted. Whereas what you said, when something could be technically, methodologically not that great, but does, end up with a result that goes along with what the consensus is, it gets accepted. That is a broken system to me. Like ideally you have a system wherein the peer review is like um checking the methodology, but potentially updating your priors when the conclusions come to something different. Like I have a friend who is a environmental engineer. His name's John Mulrow. He just started the Degrowth Institute in Chicago. And he cannot get a paper doing a full life cycle analysis of electric vehicles and all the embedded energy in it published. 'Cause that it's like worse than a old fossil fuel vehicle in terms of like total embedded energy. He can't get it published, even though it's like impeccably done. And so that's a broken system. He's kind of had to go outside the system to just talk about these conclusions he's come to doing like real engineering analysis. Um, but I mean, going back further, was there a different model than what I'm describing?
I think science used to just be a lot smaller.
Mm,
Like it's really we're producing a ton of PhDs now, and every PhD is like a person who's in a lab for 40 to 60 hours a week trying to
yeah,
get papers. And peer review used to be you submit it to the journal. They check, did you commit obvious fraud? Or is this just like duplicative of somebody else's work? And that's it. Now it's like the font in this figure is a
I
little too
know.
small, and um, you didn't cite this paper, which I wrote a while back, and it'd be better if you did. But it's funny, right? Because it's kind of like an insidious system because you can't publish. He does his analysis, he can't publish that paper, and you can talk about it on Twitter or Substack or whatever, and people will be like, "Well, it's not in a peer-reviewed journal. How do I know if it's true?" And it's
Yeah,
like, that's that honestly feels like what the system is set up for now.
yeah.
Um, it's just like enforcing a consensus as the peer-reviewed stuff is what's true, and the rest is like fringe.
Yes, yeah, there's a parallel thing happening in the study of agriculture or agriculture and the environment. And yeah, there's this guy named Alan Savory who basically like invented what we in the US call regenerative agriculture, and it's like a method of managing livestock in that kind of mimics natural ecosystems and predation. And he's got all this, sort of larger ecological studies, but the kind of science that environmentalists want to do is how much resource use throughput is happening without thinking about like resource use. For example, there's this statistic that keeps getting touted, even though it's 20 years old, and I think it was debunked like 18 years ago. How much water cattle use, quote unquote, is measured by how much rain falls on the land that they stand on. And of course, use, as in drinking, turns into urine, which is then like nutrient dense, watering of the land or whatever. So like just this concept of use totally disembodied from like this the ecosystem, every process involved. And then this is still being touted. It was just like 2 weeks ago on Twitter, somebody who's a friend of mine, in the same organization of a friend of mine, said this water use statistic and then compared it to AI data center water use, which again is not really use, it's just a cooling mechanism. So really it's a question of like how do you cool that water back down after it's heated up?
Right. No, that Yeah, I hadn't actually heard of where that statistic came from until I saw you posting that, and I was laughing because yeah, it's pretty, like, emblematic of, like, you want this conclusion, and you'll find a way to get there.
Yeah. And it's sad because I think a lot of people, again, we're in a risk society, or we're in a society where not just risk, but so disembodied from a lot of the questions. Like, for example, most people are not aware of like what it's like cattle on pasture. They just have no exposure to it. So they're not like thinking at all about what this means. Like, what would it mean to not just put a cow on 10 acres, but instead split the cow up into smaller paddocks? And then you would know, if you've ever been on this land, that that allows that other grass to grow back up. If the cattle is not on it. And so you know this stuff if you ever see it, but since you're disembodied from it, people just have to get a quick statistic, and then they're like, okay, I understand this system. It's actually one of waste and we should eradicate all livestock. And it just
Right.
tricks people. I mean, I honestly, like, it's a lot of science. And I think a lot of what happened during COVID too, and maybe we can talk about that too, um, is a way to like kind of hack people's lizard brain, where they just want to have some simple answer that makes them correct and morally correct, and follow the science, quote unquote. um and then like, yeah, then they're not expected to think in a more holistic way about it.
Yeah. No, I mean, what imagine that, like, 1 cow on 100 acres, imagine how much water that cow uses. It's like a billion gallons. Um,
And then you're like, how is this even possible? And if you know anything about like how many gallons like these things are, then you're like, wait, this doesn't make any sense. And so then it just starts to be this total absurdity if you know anything, even if you're like, for example, my brother's a sorry to cut you off quickly, but my brother's a he's a public works engineer, is a civil engineer in a small town, suburb outside of Chicago. And there was this scientific question where this guy comes in, a neighbor comes in with with a big water bill. And he's like, how did this water bill get so big? And then he looked into it and he was like, all the water use was between this like hour of 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock. But he's like, it's the amount of like the pipes you have on your property, the water could not have flowed through those pipes in that time period. So there's a glitch. But you just like if you have any sense of like the material world, you can ask these questions. You know what I mean?
no, that's true. Yeah, it feels like people are, like, so disembodied to, like, what's actually happening around them that they're just relying on someone else to tell them exactly what's going on. And,
Yeah.
yeah, if we could get back to the COVID risk thing, this was
Yeah.
like
Let's talk about that.
yeah, that was it was really tough because I paid a lot of attention to the literature, when it started up. Uh, I had to start working from home, and I'm a scientist, so, like, my work is in the lab. If I'm not in the lab, then unless I'm writing a paper, I'm not, getting much done.
Right.
So I read, like, every single paper that came out for months. I was probably, like, 100 the first 100 papers on COVID. Um, and you could very early, tell certain things. For one, you could tell that it's dangerous for old people. Like, it's worse than the flu by probably 10x for old people. And it's less dangerous than the flu for young people.
Hmm.
Um, and I think people had an extraordinarily hard time understanding, like, what does it mean to have a 1 in 15,000 chance of dying if I get this virus?
Right.
Like, is that a big risk? Like, how does that map to my daily life?
Right.
I think if you did the math, I commute on a motorcycle, um, and the risk of me dying or getting hospitalized if I got COVID was smaller than the risk of my daily commute to
Hmm.
UC Irvine. So I'm taking that risk every single day. And you could try to convey this to people, like, if you drive 500 miles in your car, that's the same amount of risk as if you get COVID, but it just doesn't really land. It it really only changed when it just kinda culturally changed around people, and I don't know what drove that, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think about, so back to the car seats, a similar example is the car seats would be, okay, if we know relatively early on that children aren't really contracting this, but then the risk of keeping all these children home and their lack of schooling and lack of socialization, and then you've got all these kids who, maybe they're toddlers and they're learning how to read faces and lips for like development of language, and they don't have that exposure, then the risk of that, which is a daily thing, is so much higher than the risk of them having any injury from this disease. Like, how does the public health decision making apparatus like, why did it happen that way?
Of course, yeah, it it went completely off the rails. It was crazy. There was absolutely no consideration of like what happens if you tell people not to see other people for 6 months, just like stay home. I had a friend who's like he was always kind of unstable, let's say. But he was a 25-year-old dude, lost his job. He like worked at a gym and he overdosed like the day he found out they weren't gonna hire him back.
Mm.
Um, and like that's a death that I'm pretty sure wouldn't have happened if it weren't for these policies, which were just like not letting people go out in public and make their own decisions. Um, and
Yeah, I
yeah, I
have
mean,
one of my friends has this picture of his son in a band concert at school with a mask on, but with a hole cut in the mask to play the trumpet or whatever.
dude, yeah, the pictures of people in like the bubbles playing a saxophone, it was just like it's like this is too much.
It was and okay, so you say in this article, and we can unpack this a little bit, the COVID article you have, or it's actually an IVF article, so we can talk a little bit about IVF too, because then it can maybe lead into your day-to-day life. But the societal response to COVID made me realize that the group dynamics that led us to the Holocaust still exist in humanity. I realize this might sound overly dramatic, but let me explain. So yeah, maybe you could explain a little bit. This is a good dovetail between your work as a scientist and my like thinking as a sociologist.
Yeah, it very rapidly turned into this in-group, out-group thing, using how seriously you take COVID as a proxy for, I think, uh, maybe class, um,
Mm.
not necessarily like financial class, but like some kind of like adherence to the science, I guess,
Yep.
is what people
Yep.
called it, right? And in California, they explicitly were making these punitive measures that really weren't geared towards public health. Like you can't get a haircut unless you get the vaccine. You can't work unless you get the vaccine. You can't enter these public spaces. I was in LA County where it was like so over the top. And to like go to a bar, you have to show your vaccine card. So it kind of seems like they're trying to create a class of people here who like one aren't contributing to the economy. They're not working. Two, they're like visibly identifiable because they're disheveled because they can't get a haircut. And they're like you're treated as like a vector for disease. Um, there were some polls, and I'm not a big truster of polls, but um, like asking people, do you think the unvaccinated should be confined to their houses? Should their kids be put in protective custody? And all of these views were surprisingly popular. Like I think like almost half of Democrats thought that the unvaccinated should be confined to their homes. It's
Yeah.
like I think people aren't really thinking through like what that actually looks like cops showing up and keeping you in your house, but like that dynamic of, like, just wanting to blame someone,
Blame and
who's
punish.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Um, so it was really dark, I think, and it's when you actually meet people who, like, didn't wanna get the vaccine, they're just, like, normal people who have different priorities.
Right. Or yeah, or like I would say there's a couple of things going on. It's almost like, the midwit meme
Mhm.
where it's like the highest and the highest and the lowest whatever, wealth, education, whatever, agree, and the one in the middle doesn't. It was kind of like that with the vaccine. It's like I think it was like people with like bachelor's and master's degrees who like can't follow kind of what the logic of all the scientific recommendations really was. We're like, just take the vaccine, don't question it. It's what the science says, even though those same scientists were saying like, or public health officials were saying, don't wear a mask. Now do wear a mask. Now, and you're just like, you see the absurdity of it. And so I think like it's almost like the least educated have been burned by the system so much, being told like this is what the experts say, and this bears out in the sociology. There's just a whole lot of, skepticism towards the expert class, and a sense that like, yeah, no, I'm not going to just like take that at face value. I'm going to kind of be skeptical of that, and I'm not necessarily going to put some experimental thing into my body. And then the people who then also on the other end of the spectrum, who are highly educated, could see through the lies of the expert class. It's like, well, maybe some of this is just public health maximalist, safetyism. And I'm not going to give my kids some vaccine when I know that it's not going to decrease any risk to them, and
Totally.
in fact, it could increase some risk because you're giving them this vaccine that is somewhat untested relatively to other vaccines.
Yeah, I mean, all it took was like a 20-minute memory, like right before the election, before the vaccine was like announced that it's getting approved. All of the public health people were saying like, I wouldn't take a Trump vaccine. Like, would you take
I
a
know.
Trump vaccine? It's like,
Yes.
and then on a dime, it turned around. So it's like, just like a minute ago, there was some insidious stuff that happened there too, where um, behind the scenes public health people were pushing Pfizer not to submit for approval before the election because they didn't want it to be seen as a political victory for Trump, which is like so cynical. If you think that this is actually going to save lives, let's just push it 2 more weeks. Like how many lives do you think you're taking?
Right. Right.
Yeah, but I mean, full disclosure, I took it. Like I thought the evidence was good enough.
Mm.
Like, I'm fine. So I don't really regret taking it. I think in terms of like if I was looking at a calculation, the difference is a 1 in 5,000 risk of myocarditis versus, I basically did nothing for my COVID risk. But at the time I was just so ready to be like, well, I got the first 2 doses because I would have got it kicked out of my university.
Right.
Then they were doing booster mandates, and at that point, I was like, "All right, enough. I'm not doing this." They kicked me off the Wi-Fi. That was, like, one of the punitive measures they took. So I'm like we had a dude in our lab who had gotten the booster. He was, like, the Schindler's List for all of the people who didn't wanna get the booster were all on his account. Um, yeah.
That's so funny. I want to switch over to this IVF question too, but before we do, what is your take on RFK? Do you have
Uh,
one?
yeah, I have, like, mixed feelings about it. On Like, my philosophical underlying thing is I assume that things aren't bad for you unless I see evidence that they're bad for you. Um, so I'm worried that a lot of the energy, uh, of, like, the MAHA RFK movement will go towards things that probably aren't that important. Um, like, for example, I'm not so sure that Red 40 is, like, the cause of, like,
Well,
baby.
again, going back to the risk society thing, you can't really isolate like some of these things. Although my thing has always been like you could do a more European precautionary principle thing where if you can't prove it's not harm, if you can't prove it's like completely safe, then just like, do we need that? Is there some alternative that we could use? Kind of thing.
Yeah, it's not so bad. Like, I don't think um it's not gonna be, like, a super bad thing to take. I don't think Red 40 is keeping us healthy either, you know?
Right.
Um, I guess the question is, like, what do manufacturers replace it with? Evidently, Americans like colorful food, so, like, do they replace it with something also untested and worse? Could you pass legislation that, like, actually prevents people from doing that?
Right.
Um, so I guess my worry is that a lot of the energy will go towards things that actually don't really matter.
Mm.
Um,
And
yeah.
also, I mean, I also have a question about like public trust. I feel like we are in such a bad state when it comes to public trust of public health officials. And I think on the one hand, at least the optimist in me is saying maybe the people who have been most burned and most skeptical might you might gain some trust back with RFK in the sense of like, let's actually like test some of these vaccines, not just the COVID one, but the other one. Let's do like more robust scientific testing and talk about it like in a public debate kind of format. Like, does the vaccine schedule need to be way longer and sooner than it was even 20 years ago or 30 years ago, whatever? Let's just have a discussion. Then you're kind of bringing people back in to the conversation. But then I also think the doomer in me thinks like it's so polarized. I just saw something today where RFK said something pro measles vaccine, and all the anti-vaxxers just got mad and were like, "This isn't who was supporting." Um,
Yeah,
so I don't
yeah.
know. Is it too polarized? Do you think it's like too far gone?
I think that might be mostly like on Twitter. I think people in general are like paying less attention and are less
Mm,
inflamed. Um, just like out of the sphere that actually talks about it.
right.
Um, I think, yeah, I totally agree with you. It's super obvious that people don't really trust the medical establishment anymore. COVID has a ton to do with that. And yeah, before COVID, I never would have like really raised questions like, if I have a kid, do they need to get like 40 vaccines in the first few months?
Right.
Um, and now I'll certainly look into it, and I like whatever I think is not supported, I'm not going to get, you know.
Right. Right.
So
Uh,
so like restoring that kind of trust where you know that the things that are being recommended are actually supported by evidence, that would be a huge positive. And whether RFK is like focused enough to achieve something like that, um, I think remains to be seen.
yeah.
Um,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think with any politician, I'm kind of like business as usual is so bad. Maybe getting somebody new in there who's not going to be business as usual could be good, but remains to be seen kind of thing. Um, Before we move on to IVF, I'm curious, like going back to the sunscreen discussion, or you said you don't go to the doctor, or you'll go if you need to, or when it comes to vaccines and vaccine schedule and kids, would you look into it before deciding what to do and make independent decisions? Full disclosure, I'm mostly just stuck with the vaccine schedule, maybe like a little bit delayed for my kids. And I was fine with it. There were a couple things at birth I didn't do, like there's this eye ointment you give to infants if their mother has gonorrhea, but you get tested at the beginning of the pregnancy for STDs, and if you don't have any other partners, then you don't have gonorrhea. And I didn't have any other partners, so I like don't need the eye ointment. So it's like one of those things where it's like, no, we'll just give it to them because if you do have gonorrhea, then they could go blind. I'm like, but I don't.
right, right,
So
right.
I'm not doing it. And so it's like one of those things where like there's just so obvious safetyism and like, yeah, I know what the situation is. I don't need to do that. But yeah, like what do you do? Do you wear sunscreen? You don't go to the doctor? Do you just independently make these decisions for yourself? And like what do you think other people should just kind of be independent in that way?
Yeah, I just don't think too much about it. I mean, like I I think people forget that, like, for all of human history, except for the last, few thousand years, we were walking around outside, like, living in caves, eating dirt, eating, like, berries off of, whatever. So we evolved to be a lot more robust and capable of just dealing with, like, not perfectly optimal nutrition, not perfectly optimal, um, sun exposure, whatever. Um, so for me, I exercise like 5 times a week because I like it. Uh, I fast or I don't eat breakfast because my mornings are busy and that's how I prefer to be. Um, I think just like figuring out like stable, like healthy habits, is good enough, and I think that'll take you, like, 99% of the way, and if you go to a doctor and, like, maybe your blood pressure is a little bit outside of the norm for your age, like, are they gonna put you on a blood pressure medication when
Right,
you're 30? Like, now you're gonna take this medicine for the rest of your life that we
right,
don't really know? So I think I just try to avoid, um adding things, like, daily to my life. Like, I wear sunscreen if I go to the beach because otherwise I would be a tomato the next day, but I don't, like, reapply it 5 times. Like, I'm fine
right.
with getting a little bit burned. Um,
Right. You said at the end of your sunscreen article, which was really funny, like being tanner is hotter. So you're trading like being tanner when you're younger and looking hotter to looking maybe like a little less hot later on in life, potentially with some wrinkles or whatever. And it's just like, yeah, I think that there's a way in which you can go totally overboard with the safetyist and safetyism and maximalism and like researching, and instead like, you know, more or less it's like kind of Pareto principle. I am that way with like my kids' health and safety. It's like, you know, you go 20% of the safety, you'll probably get 80% of the way there. It's like if the kids want to have a sleepover and we didn't bring an extra car seat to put in somebody's car, the 2-year-old can go in a chest belt, for the short ride. It's not going to be the end of the world. Then they're not going to get left out. Like, these kinds of things. And 80% of the time, they're eating healthy food. 20% they can get snacks and treats and like even processed stuff like Oreos, whatever. There's a way in which you can get like super OCD about these things, and that's been my approach too, which is just kind of like, just live your life.
totally, totally.
It's not that complicated. And it's funny to come to that conclusion after like kind of digging into so many of these things. Like, okay, well, there's only so much I can control, one way or another, something's gonna kill me. So unless you're Brian Johnson, then you'll just live
I
forever.
no, I'm highly skeptical about all the stuff he's doing. I think he's he's leaning on all these, like, biomarkers, and the evidence behind all the biomarkers is, like, as shady as the evidence behind anything. Um, I think he'll live, like, within a standard deviation of the average lifespan of a
Yeah.
man of his wealth, is my guess.
Yeah, right, right, totally. That's my sense too. I had an interaction with him on Twitter once where I was kind of making fun of him because he went out dancing and he said in his post, I used to love dancing, and this is what makes me really sad. I used to really love dancing and I went out dancing, not no alcohol, and he didn't even stay up late. He went to bed at his normal time, which I guess is like 8 p.m. or 7 p.m. or whatever, something ridiculously early, and just because he had gone dancing, his sleep was bad that night, and he was, like, off and in pain, quote, unquote, for, like, 2 or 3 days, and I was like, there's
Yeah,
a
you're ma
point at which the maximalism of, like, "living forever," quote, unquote, but living for what? If you can't live and enjoy the things you enjoy in life, what is the point? And, like, that's a qualitative question. It's not a scientific one, you know?
No, totally. I really hate the trend of, like, being so health optimizing. Like, if you don't wanna drink for, like, personal reasons, fine, but, like, you will miss certain things in life. Like, certain things happen at bars, like, there's certain experiences that you just can't have
Right.
if you're such an absolutist about this kinda thing.
Right.
Um,
Everything
so
in moderation, you know?
yeah, yeah. I think it's just
Okay, so now I am very curious your take on this IVF question, because this is something I've been kind of like just mulling over. It's actually like I don't have strong conclusions really about IVF and surrogacy, and people are saying like, artificial wombs are on the horizon, this kind of thing. I don't I mean, artificial wombs kinda just basically horrify me. I'm pretty much qualitatively against. Um, IVF, I have a lot of friends who have done it and are doing it. Um, I can see the use case for it, but all I'm saying is there are, like, moral and scientific questions embedded here, and it's worth talking about some of those, and maybe coming to our own conclusions, or coming to, independently different people will come to conclusions, but it's worth at least talking about like what's involved, because I think, again, what happens with a lot of scientific questions is it's like out of sight, out of mind. Oh, a beautiful miracle baby resulted from this process, but what's involved in the process, and then what does that mean for us morally is my question. So let's just talk a little bit about like what you learned about what's involved in your feeling about it.
well, it's not IVF itself is not something I've looked into super deeply. I'm familiar with the general process of, like,
Yeah.
taking an egg and a sperm and implanting it. Um, what got me interested in, like, writing an article about it was a company which is kinda taking it to the next level,
Yeah.
which is where I start to get uncomfortable. Um, so what's happening now with IVF is, the process is you take 8 eggs, and you get 8, like, little embryos, and you could screen some of them for, like, basic diseases like Down syndrome, um, which feels almost okay for some people, but now it's going to the next level where you do a whole genome sequencing, and you can get some predictive model for like, okay, this one will be the tallest, this one will be the smartest, this one will be like a little bit of both,
Mhm.
um, and then
I'll
you're
just say
getting
one
into
point of
some.
clarification. I do think that now, if you have 8 viable embryos, you still do have to decide amongst those which ones to implant, and usually there's, like, some kind of fitness indicator, like how strong and virile or something that the embryo seems to be, like how likely it is to survive, so you're already kinda messing genetically with by being able to choose and observe which one gets implanted or whatever, but then I think, this other company is providing a next step in terms of, like, total information that you're getting to determine between those. Sorry, but I
Mhm.
just point of clarification.
Sure, sure. Um, and then there's like the next level, which no one's really doing yet. There was that one guy in China who did this. Um, but the next level is like doing genetic editing of embryos, which is like a barrier that it's something that like all of the world should have a big conversation about. Like, what kind of planet do you want to live on?
Yeah.
But it's just, frankly, I don't think it's going to happen. I think if China wants to do it, they're going to start doing it, and then if there's like an international pressure to start doing it, you know, people will either do it here or they'll go to China to get it done. Um, so I'm kind of a doomer in like stopping technology, I guess. But as far as like the moral question of IVF, I my personal feeling is I just think whatever lets kids have or lets people have genetic children is a good thing. Um, and for people who can't reproduce, um, and they want to have their own like biological offspring, that's a life changing thing. It can give your
Mhm.
life a completely different meaning. Um, So I'm all for it in that setting, and I think, more people should be having kids. If it helps more people have kids, then great.
Mhm.
Um, there's some downside of, like, because it kind of encourages, like, waiting longer to start having a family, and, I'm a little spreadsheet brain, right? I'm 29. I want kids, but, like and I want them as soon as possible, but I'm like, I don't feel secure enough yet, like, I don't have
Mm.
the money, the stability, um but it's like, okay, in the worst case, there's new technology and it's like it's not like you're not gonna be able to have kids.
Right.
So, I think that that could be like a small societal cost, but I just think the benefits of it really outweigh the costs.
Mm. I'm not I don't, like, have strong conclusions one way or another in terms of benefits and costs. I just like I said before, if you're already just as a part of the process screening embryos, I'm not talking about the individuals who many of whom are, like, people I love, who want to have kids and for, whatever reason, like, waited or whatever risk society-based reason we live in that there's, like, fertility issues, want to have kids, and I want that for them, but there are, like, just moral questions, like, I think you raise in your article too, class-based questions, like, okay, so maybe this is only available and like surrogacy is only available to very wealthy people. Okay, so then you can very easily see a world in which like eugenics is available to a certain class and not to another class. And then you kind of draw parallels with the unwashed, unvaccinated, um, and you can see pretty quickly a kind of bifurcated society where there's a whole class of edited, genetic specimens, and then a whole class of those who don't have access to those things, which, in my opinion, that other class who's having kids naturally might be more robust physically. You know what I mean? Just because they're subject to if they're surviving naturally, they're subject to these, regular pressures, but then they might maybe there's other things you could edit for where this other class has got this whole like different kind of human. And there's like big problems with that, I feel like.
Yeah. Uh, I don't think you're wrong. I just to like frame this in like more concrete terms. sh- I could like talk about CRISPR a little bit
Yeah,
and
sure.
how it works. Yeah. So yeah, CRISPR it was originally discovered as a viral uh, defense system in bacteria, but basically what it lets you do is just make a cut in any piece of DNA that you define. Um, and there's a few CRISPR clinical trials going on, and there's kind of a branch in CRISPR. One is somatic gene editing. So that would be like if you or me took a CRISPR pill, which goes into your liver and maybe knocks out some protein, which is causing a problem for you. But it doesn't change the DNA that's in your eggs. So whatever change happens in like a somatic setting will not be heritable. And the other kind is germline editing, which is where you edit either the egg or the sperm, or the all of the cells in the embryo when it's just like 2 or 3 cells. And that change would be present in the whole body of whatever organism springs from it. Um, so like that's
And
the
both are
line.
currently like being used.
No.
Okay.
So somatic ones are in clinical trials.
Okay.
Um, for like pretty rare diseases for the most part. I think sickle cell is pretty far along. Um, and it's a good treatment because like the upside is you take it once, it fixes the problem, and you never take another pill. So that's like the real big upside. Um, there's only been one documented case of germline editing, and there was a big controversy about it. This dude has kind of started popping up on Twitter,
Wait, I've
more often,
seen
like
this guy.
John
Chinese?
Quay, who, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. He did a kind of a pointless edit to prevent some kids from inheriting some STD from the parents, but there's like already good treatments to like prevent that from happening. So it was mostly just to like, I think, be the one to like take that leap of like, I'm the first one to do this thing
And this
now.
is a child that exists right
Yeah,
now?
yeah.
Okay.
They're healthy. I think
Okay.
you can make these small one-off things. I think you could do it pretty safely now if people wanted to. Um, but like to engineer traits is something that I don't know if it'll ever be possible. Um, like you want to make your kid into this thing. These things are all like very polygenic, meaning that like thousands of genes go into it, and we can't change like 10. And it's like maybe the technology will get there someday, but we're so far away from it that I don't see what steps would even have to happen to make it go.
Okay.
Um, but there are certain things that like are monogenic, like you could fix a disease, for example. Like if you have a broken copy of this gene, which causes a lot of problems for you, you could go into the germline and like swap that out. And like the two scenarios are like, say it works great. Now you have like a normal, healthy, happy child, or you have a child who's going to live for 5 months in agony and then die. Um, so, where do you draw the line there?
Yeah, right. I mean, I can see the use case for that. Yeah.
Yeah. So
That would only happen in like an IVF scenario. Like you wouldn't be able to screen that in utero.
no, no, because you basically have to do it as early as possible.
Okay.
Because if you don't get it into every single cell, which needs to be edited, it's very difficult when you're like a fully formed being. Uh,
Yeah, right. Okay. So then it again, that would be something only available to people who have the money or means to do IVF.
for sure. And if you're like in that setting and you're sequencing genomes, you're also getting information of like, it's not so predictive right now. Like you can maybe skew it by like 2 to 3 IQ points. Maybe the
Mm.
algorithms get better. Maybe it's just stochastic and you'll never be able to predict it because it's just like the result of processes that happen independent of the genome. Um, but you can certainly like get an edge,
Mm.
and just like further this divide of like people who have an edge and now you have a bigger edge. Um, and I think that could create a really ugly world, but at the same time, like I don't know, I don't think there's a way to stop it. I mean,
Mm.
that's kind of my feeling.
So now going back full circle to your work, biomedical engineering, and specifically, I'd be curious what kinds of things you're interested in working on. And if you are like engaged with, or your peers in your PhD program or your advisors are engaged with thinking about these moral questions in the midst of doing either the science or the inventing, really.
So like my day-to-day research is in in an evolution lab. Called directed evolution. And people use that for like improving either antibodies, like if there's some drugs that are you just inject a protein which binds something, and that can help with cancer. There's a bunch of cancer antibodies, things like that. So that's like the practical application of it. Um, and I'm doing research into how evolution works. Um, and just like with everything else, there's a lot of certainty expressed about how evolution works that's completely unjustified.
Okay.
Um, so I've built like a really neat system, which is going to be. I'm home today because I'm working on the manuscript for that paper.
Nice.
Um, yeah, that will, I think, put a little chip, and maybe start to like change how people think about evolution. Um, but in terms of the ethical questions, I mean, no one's really. I don't know. The work doesn't feel so important that we have to contend with it. I mean, I worked at a couple CRISPR companies before I came back to school, and it's certainly a topic of conversation there. And the kind of the party line of people at CRISPR companies is uh, don't don't do germline editing.
Okay.
Only somatic editing. But that's certainly a conversation that some people are having in the field. I just don't know how
What
much.
what what is the reasoning they give?
The reasoning is, like Nazi Germany, like it's it's not a hard track to take of like to see what happens when you start going down that road.
Yeah,
But I just don't know how much the conversations matter. Because it's like if someone can do it, then it'll be done. And if rich people want that service, then and they can buy it, they'll buy it, right?
right.
Um,
I mean, as a scientist potentially tinkering with the mechanism to do it and having control over whether or not you keep developing it, that would be like the point at which you stop it. But I mean, if any scientist goes rogue and does it, then you can't really
yeah,
stop them.
right. Uh, I'm pessimistic about stopping uh, progress, if you want to call it that. In general, it's kind of just how things unfold. Um, and for me, I wouldn't want to work at a company working on any of those technologies. I would. I want to be in something that is doing something good and interesting and
Hmm.
new and like generating new information for people to work with, like about humanity, how things work. Um, Like, I wouldn't wanna be part of an embryo editing startup, for example.
Right.
Um, uh, but at the same time, it's yeah, I think we're all a little bit, helpless in controlling how things go.
Right. But okay, so then I have a separate question in terms of like who would have people do have agency in some of these things. I think a lot of times, um, for example, without sounding too judgmental, I know of people who have gotten surrogacy for no medical reason, just because they didn't feel like carrying a baby. And they just, there's increasing evidence. I don't like understand the science that well, but that there's like some genetic exchange happening between the surrogate mother and the fetus. And so now this baby's got like other potential genetic material being carried by this other mother whose whole body then like, has gone through the pregnancy and is creating the milk that's for that baby, but now the baby's with some other mother and, okay, babies get fed formula all the time, whatever, but downstream, I tend to think, and this is just a totally qualitative assessment, that if you have all of these interventions you know, you have to do an intervention for IVF, or, you have to separately fertilize, separate surrogate. I actually babysat for a family once in San Francisco, two gay dads who each put a sperm into a separate egg of their friend who they harvested the egg from into a separate surrogate. So in this case, it's one dad, the other, so for twins, one dad, the other dad, a third person woman's egg, and the fourth woman's body, four people's genetic material involved in these two babies. Um, and that was like 10 years ago. So more than 10, I think 13, 15, something like that. Um, I can't imagine like how far this has come, but I kind of think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and this is kind of a controversial thing to say. I can imagine a scenario in which you have all these interventions, everything is so science based that you could potentially have like a less, you're messing with the baby so much that you have a less robust kid at the end than a kid that was just born of all these natural um things. And I think about something like, do you know that I think it's the American bulldog can't like get pregnant. You have to be artificially inseminated and then they have to have a C-section. And it's one
Sure.
of those things where like this dog only continues to exist because somebody is, sticking semen up in there and then cutting the dog open. Like you get to a point where it's like you can't, there is no biological mechanism anymore. If you have all these kids who are born, they have to be born this way. I don't know. Anyways, I'm curious your thought as somebody who works on evolution.
Um, I think it's okay. I don't think that's a super justified concern. I think there's things you can look at. Um, One thing I say pretty frequently is like sequence don't lie. You can sequence the genome of a child, and if it's indistinguishable, like if they're made with IVF or if they're conceived naturally, um, that's a good that's a good idea that there's no necessarily reason to be concerned.
Mm,
Um, the other thing is you can just look at outcomes of children born with IVF versus children conceived naturally. There's this there's kind of a related thing that's being raised as more on the right, uh, on like the kind of disgusting part of the right,
yeah.
um, of like removing the effect of removing genetic selection on like the human, um, like the integrity of the human genome, and it's like mutations are accumulating here, but all of that is also it's really unjustified in terms of what we actually understand about how life works, which is very little. So it it's raising a concern without evidence that there's anything wrong. It's raising a concern that someday down the line, if we do this thing, it might go wrong, uh, despite the best evidence that we have for now saying that it won't. Um, and maybe it will, but
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't see it. Um,
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking like along the lines of mothers who end up in C-sections, and sometimes that's like the sunscreen thing, overdiagnosis, and they don't actually need a C-section, but then, more and more babies being born by a C-section is it like could select for then other babies whose pelvises are getting smaller and smaller because do you understand do you know what I mean? Where it's like
Maybe.
you can't birth naturally.
I could see it. Um, I could see there also being some effect of children being born to like older mothers.
Mm,
I could see there being small effects. Um, but frankly, I don't think they're going to be like important enough to really influence much.
okay. Do you have any other concerns, like evolutionarily, with just various fertility issues that seem to be cropping up?
I
Like
think
what it could potentially result in, many generations down the line?
Uh, in terms of like fertility issues now, I think people are just less active and eat more in general, and I think that that makes people less fertile on average.
Mm,
Um, I think that's probably the biggest driver of it, and there's maybe marginal things like the chemicals in sunscreen,
yeah.
microplastics, but I think that those are all fairly marginal rather when compared to like just the are you living a healthy life and getting pregnant early.
Right.
Um,
Or yeah. Right.
I yeah, I
So
think
we're not heading toward a Children of Men scenario. You don't think?
I don't know that reference
Oh,
actually.
it's a movie where it's like set in 20, I think 2025 or 2027 in England, but no babies have been born for like 18 years and they can't really pinpoint the cause, and then some woman ends up pregnant, and so
I really doubt it. I
okay.
really, really doubt it. This is yeah, the nothing ever happens. I mean, yeah, I think we're just at an age now that we can really be concerned about these kinds of things, I think,
Mm,
and maybe these kinds of concerns about collapse of humanity have always existed.
mm,
You know, maybe people were having the same conversation in 1900s, like, will the last baby be born in 1980, you know?
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I just don't it doesn't really influence me that much.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I mean, we a totally separate series of concerns I have are ones about like especially with surrogacy, like biology and ownership, like I don't know, like exploitation and going across borders to pay surrogate mothers and then not claiming babies as if they're like, you know, consumer products and stuff like that, like sociological issues around it. I have like, but it's not really a scientific question as much as a like social one, cultural one. Anything we didn't yet cover that you feel like would be good to that you thought about before this conversation would be good to get kind of out while we're still talking.
I didn't really have much intention. Um, I have a lot of things to say about a lot of things.
Right. Anything we didn't touch on any of like the sunscreen question, ontology, IVF, anything else like on these particular topics that I didn't ask that you want to say?
I think we covered a lot of them. I've if you there's more on my website. There's like little ones. You know, I looked into fluoride a little bit, which is you know, probably pointless in water. I'm working on a smoking one, like how bad is smoking for you actually? And the answer is pretty bad, but that's complicated what that actually means. But in terms of stuff I want to talk about, yeah, no, I think I'll leave it up to you.
Okay, that's good. Yeah. We can link to your website in the show notes. It is olekp.com, which is pretty easy, OLEKP.com. And you've got a little blog there. It's really nice to have somebody who like goes through the, you know, some of the research that's been done and like comes to some conclusions like this. Fluoride, do you think we don't need to put it in water?
Probably not. Actually, no, definitely not.
We should
We
not put
should
it in water.
not put it in water.
And
No.
should we have fluoride toothpaste?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
I think as long as you don't swallow, as long as you're not drinking it as a young child, it's fine.
Okay. Maybe you
Or a
should
pregnant mother. Yeah.
okay. Maybe you should after you've gone through a series of these, come back on and just give us like life and health advice. Just
I think
literally say like only wear sunscreen when you go to the beach. You can drink sometimes if it leads to like social enjoyment, you know, X, Y, and Z. Exercise, especially if it makes you feel good, and you know, all this stuff like Oleg's guide to a healthy life.
yeah, cook more. I think that'll
Cook
capture
more at
most of the
home.
advice. Yeah.
I love that. All right. Well, thank you so much. This was so nice. So nice to meet you.
Yeah, it was nice to meet you. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah.